The late afternoon sun stretched golden rays across the quiet suburban street, dappling the pavement as Malcolm Hayes walked in measured strides. Rex, his loyal German shepherd, moved in perfect sync beside him, ears flicking at the distant hum of a lawnmower, the occasional chirp of hidden birds. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, the kind of scent that should have been comforting, but Malcolm knew better. He felt it the weight of watchful eyes lingering too long, the barely perceptible shift of curtains in upstairs windows, the jogger who hesitated just a second too long before continuing. It was always the same, the unspoken message, the quiet, creeping suspicion. He had spent years protecting people who would never know his name, dismantling threats in places where stepping into the wrong alley meant never stepping out again. Yet here, in the very neighborhood he called home, he was still the one who didn't belong. Then, the low rumble of an approaching engine broke the fragile quiet. A black and white police cruiser slowed to a crawl beside him, its presence as deliberate as it was familiar. Malcolm's grip on Rex's leash tightened just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. The German shepherd, trained to read his handler's tension, lifted his head, muscles coiling with quiet anticipation. A voice cut through the stillness. "Afternoon, sir." Malcolm turned, his movements controlled, measured. Officer Garrett Coleman leaned against the open window, his sharp eyes scanning Malcolm like a predator sizing up prey. "You live around here?" Coleman asked, his tone light. Too light, like a man who already knew the answer, but was waiting for an excuse to hear something else. And just like that, the moment of peace shattered. The air hung heavy between them. Malcolm Hayes met Officer Garrett Coleman's GA Rex remained still. "I live here," Malcolm answered evenly, his voice polite but firm. Coleman's smirk twitched, like he wasn't expecting Malcolm's confidence. "That so? Funny, don't think I've seen you before." Before Malcolm could respond, the passenger door opened and Officer Andrew Mitchell stepped out. He moved slowly, purposefully, boots crunching against the pavement as he positioned himself just a few steps away, close enough to intimidate, far enough to deny it was intentional. Malcolm had seen this tactic before, a pressure play. "We got a call about someone suspicious in the neighborhood," Coleman continued, resting his arm on the open window. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Suspicious? A black man walking his dog? He had been here before this same tired routine. But experience had taught him one thing: stay calm, give them nothing to twist. "Didn't realize walking my dog was suspicious," Malcolm said. "You'd be surprised," Coleman said, his smirk widening. Mitchell took a step closer, eyes dropping to Rex. "That's a big dog?" he muttered, voice laced with false curiosity. "Trained?" "Yes," Malcolm answered. "For what?" "Obedience, protection." Mitchell scoffed, shaking his head. Protection from what? Malcolm didn't answer. He knew where this was going. Coleman's smirk faded. "Gonna need to see some ID." Malcolm knew his rights. He could refuse. He could demand to know why. But he also knew what kind of men he was dealing with. Without a word, he reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, no sudden movements, no excuses given. But Rex sensed something. The barely audible growl from deep in his chest made Malcolm pause. "Easy, boy," Malcolm murmured, giving the leash a light tug. Mitchell's eyes flicked to the dog. His hand twitched toward his holster. "Whoa," Mitchell muttered, his tone sharper now. "You might want to control that thing." Malcolm's patience thinned. He's controlled. He's trained. Coleman let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah? We'll see about that." The tension thickened, suffocating. Malcolm handed over his ID. Coleman barely glanced at it before shoving it back, unimpressed. "I think we'll need you to step over here for a second. Just a few more questions." Malcolm exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I've already answered your questions." Mitchell took another step forward. "I don't know, Coleman. Something about his attitude don't sit right with me." Coleman nodded, his eyes cold. "Yeah, almost like he's got something to hide." Malcolm's fingers tightened around the leash. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just another stop. This was something else. Then Mitchell reached for him, a hand on his wrist, a grip too tight, a move too aggressive. Rex reacted before Malcolm could even process the moment. A single sharp bark, a shift of muscle, and then came the gunshot. The gunshot ripped through the air. Rex stumbled backward, his powerful body collapsing against Malcolm's legs, a sharp whimper escaping his throat. For a moment, everything seemed to slow the flashing lights of the police cruiser, the weight of his dog's body pressing into him, the warmth of blood pooling between his fingers as he instinctively reached out to hold Rex. Number? Malcolm's breath hitched, his mind snapping between grief and fury. His best friend, his protector, his shadow shot down in cold blood for nothing. His heart pounded, but his instincts, honed through years of training, kept him from lunging, from doing what every fiber of his being screamed at him to do. He knew how this worked. He knew exactly what came next. "Get that dog back!" Mitchell barked, his gun still raised, though Rex was no longer moving. Malcolm's hands shook as he cradled Rex's head, his fingers slick with his dog's blood. He barely heard the officers shouting anymore. Everything around him blurred, the only thing in focus being the final, shallow breath that left Rex's body. Something inside him snapped. He surged upward, rage overriding reason. But before he could move, a sharp jolt of pain exploded through his spine. The crackle of a taser filled the night air, and then Malcolm was falling, his body seizing as volts of electricity ripped through him. He hit the pavement hard, his face slamming against the concrete, the taste of blood filling his mouth. Boots on his back, knees on his arms, cold metal biting into his wrists. "Stay down! Hands behind your back, now!" Malcolm gasped for breath, his muscles still spasming from the taser, but he forced himself to go still. He had no choice. If he so much as twitched, they would use it as an excuse. They already wanted an excuse. "That's right," Coleman muttered, satisfaction dripping from his voice. "That's where you belong." Malcolm let out a hoarse, guttural sound. It wasn't pain. It was rage, raw and unfiltered, clawing its way out of his chest. He struggled, but their weight kept him pinned. "You murdered him!" Malcolm roared, his voice breaking as he thrashed against the cuffs. "You killed my dog!" But no one listened. Coleman and Mitchell dragged him up, shoving him toward the back of the cruiser. Neighbors had begun peeking out of their windows, drawn by the chaos, but none of them stepped forward. No one ever did. As the door slammed shut behind him, the reality of it all sank in. Rex was gone, and Malcolm Hayes, a man who had fought for this country, who had spent his life protecting others, who had never lost control, was now a prisoner. The ride to the station was silent, suffocating, the only sound the faint hum of the cruiser's engine and the distant crackle of the radio. Malcolm Hayes sat in the back, wrists cuffed, blood drying on his skin, some of it his, most of it Rex's. His breaths came slow and measured, but inside, something dark and cold was settling in. He had fought battles in places where death was constant, where justice was a luxury, but nothing had ever felt as wrong as this. Across from him, through the metal barrier, Officers Garrett Coleman and Andrew Mitchell sat relaxed, their postures casual, as if this was just another routine arrest, another day of wielding unchecked power. "You should have just done what you were told," Mitchell muttered, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Malcolm didn't respond. There was no point. These men weren't interested in the truth, if only control. The station was a blur of flashing cameras, murmured conversations, and cold, indifferent faces. Malcolm barely registered the booking process, the fingerprints, the mug shot, the sharp bite of the cuffs being removed, only to be replaced with the invisible weight of injustice. Then Jasmine Hayes stormed in. His sister, all sharp edges and unwavering resolve, cut through the room like a blade. Her power suit was impeccable, her heels clicking against the tile with a confidence that even the officers seemed reluctant to challenge. "You're done holding him," she snapped, shoving a stack of papers into the nearest officer's chest. "Unless you want this department to be buried under more lawsuits than you can count." Coleman and Mitchell stood off to the side, watching with smug amusement, but that amusement flickered when Jasmine turned her glare on them. "This isn't over," she promised, voice low, steady, dangerous. Malcolm exhaled slowly as they let him out, the weight of Jasmine's presence keeping him grounded, but only barely. The city lights blurred as he stepped into the night, exhaustion sinking into his bones, but there was no relief, no peace, only the deafening absence of Rex at his side. Justice through the courts? He wanted to believe in it. Jasmine did, but deep down, he knew. The system had already closed ranks. By the time Malcolm sat alone in his kitchen that night, staring at Rex's leash curled on the counter, he knew what had to be done. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about retribution. The house was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. Nothing felt peaceful anymore. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, the dim light casting sharp shadows across his face. In front of him, Rex's leash lay coiled, untouched, a painful reminder of what had been stolen from him. His fingers traced the worn leather absently, his mind moving in calculated steps. This wasn't grief anymore. It was purpose. For 2 days, Malcolm did nothing but watch, study, plan. He didn't sleep much, didn't need to. Adrenaline replaced exhaustion. Rage sharpened his focus. He followed Officer Garrett Coleman first, learning his patterns, his routines, his weaknesses. Coleman was arrogant, predictable. He drank at the same bar every night, parked in the same alleyway, walked the same careless path home. He had no reason to be afraid until now. Malcolm waited in the darkness of the alley, his breath steady, his heartbeat slow. Coleman stumbled out of the bar, his confidence swaying with every whiskey he had downed. He didn't check his surroundings. Why would he? In his world, he was the one who made people afraid. Tonight, that would change. The second Coleman bent down to fumble with his keys, Malcolm struck. A single precise kick to the ribs sent the officer crashing against the brick wall. He let out a sharp gasp, his hands scrambling for balance, but Malcolm was faster. He grabbed Coleman by the collar, dragging him up just to slam him back down, his head bouncing against the pavement with a sickening crack. Coleman choked on a breath, his vision swimming. He wasn't in control anymore. "Who?" Coleman wheezed, his voice a broken whisper. Malcolm leaned in, his grip tightening on the man's shirt, voice low and deadly calm. "You don't get to know who I am," he murmured. "Not yet." He released him, letting Coleman slump to the ground. He didn't need to kill him, not yet. Fear would do the work for him. As Malcolm turned, disappearing back into the shadows, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Fear had set in. For the first time in his life, Garrett Coleman was afraid. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated how others felt. Fear, submission, powerlessness. But now he was the one looking over his shoulder. And Andrew Mitchell noticed. Coleman had barely spoken since the attack. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something tight, restrained, haunted. Mitchell watched him closely, noting the subtle shifts, the stiffness in his movements, the way he flinched when someone passed too close, the fact that his hand now hovered near his gun more than usual. Then Coleman told him. Someone had come after him. A ghost in the dark, a shadow that struck hard and fast, leaving him bruised and shaken in an alley behind a bar. Mitchell laughed at first. "Some drunk off the street?" he scoffed. "You're jumpy for nothing." But Coleman wasn't laughing, and when he looked at Mitchell, something about his expression sent a chill through the man. "He knew me," Coleman muttered. "He knew everything." Mitchell's grin faded. That night, as Mitchell drove home, he couldn't shake the unease creeping under his skin. He wasn't afraid, he refused to be. He was the predator, always had been. Still, he kept checking his mirrors. By the time he parked, his nerves were stretched thin. He sat in his car for a long moment, gripping the wheel. Nothing was wrong. Then he heard it. A sharp knock against the driver's side window. Mitchell turned sharply, his breath catching. No one was there. The world was still. Too still. Heart hammering, Mitchell reached for his gun, stepping out slowly, scanning the darkness. The street was empty. His porch light flickered in the distance, casting weak shadows along the pavement. His breath felt too loud in the silence. Then, a voice behind him. "Long night?" Mitchell spun, drawing his weapon, but it was too late. A fist drove into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He staggered, gun slipping from his grasp. Another strike hard, calculated, precise, sent him crashing onto the pavement. Malcolm stood over him. Mitchell wheezed, his body twisting in pain. This wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery. This was punishment. Malcolm crouched, his voice low, controlled, dangerous. "You remember me now, don't you?" Mitchell did, and for the first time, he knew what it was like to be the one who was powerless. Mitchell could still feel the bruises forming beneath his skin. Every breath was a reminder of what had happened. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, not just the rage, but the control, the patience. This wasn't random, this was a hunt. And he and Coleman were the prey. They had spent years in power, untouchable, operating with the certainty that their badges would protect them, that no one would ever fight back. Now, someone had. Mitchell sat in his squad car, his hands gripping the wheel too tightly. Across from him, Coleman looked just as bad, his bruises darker, his pride even more shattered. He knew exactly what Mitchell was thinking. "We need to find him first," Coleman muttered. Mitchell nodded. "We start in the streets, shake some people down, see who's talking." They weren't going to wait for the system to handle this. They would handle it themselves. Malcolm had anticipated this. He had spent enough time watching Coleman and Mitchell to know how they would react. Men like them didn't look inward, they lashed out. And that's exactly what they did. He followed them as they went after the wrong people again. First, it was Taryn Briggs, a local boxing trainer and former fighter. They cornered him outside his gym, pressing him for information. But Taryn didn't break. He never had. Then it was Dwayne Carter, a man who had already been a victim of their brutality once before. They barged into his apartment, pushing him against the wall, demanding to know who was behind this. But Malcolm was smarter than them. He didn't leave loose ends. He didn't leave witnesses. And most importantly, he had been watching. He had recorded everything. From the moment Coleman and Mitchell had forced their way into homes and businesses, from the moment they had crossed every line they weren't supposed to, Malcolm had the proof. That night, he released it all. A series of anonymous emails, to journalists, to internal affairs, to the right people inside the department who had been waiting for an excuse to act. And then he waited, because the fire had already been lit. And this time, Coleman and Mitchell wouldn't be able to put it out. The city was no longer silent. The streets buzzed with anger, with calls for justice, with a demand that could no longer be ignored. The leaked footage had spread like wildfire, Coleman and Mitchell, forcing their way into homes, brutalizing people, wielding their power like a weapon. The public had seen them for what they were, and now they wanted blood. Malcolm watched from the shadows as the department scrambled, as Coleman and Mitchell were placed on administrative leave, a desperate attempt to contain the fallout. But it wasn't enough. The trial was inevitable. When the charges were announced, the headlines came fast and ruthless. Officers indicted for brutality and misconduct, shocking footage sparks, outrage in community systemic corruption. Exposed, how deep does it go? The case was too big to bury. The department had to throw someone to the wolves to save themselves. And so, for the first time in their careers, Coleman and Mitchell found themselves on the wrong side of the system they had abused. The courtroom was packed, cameras flashing, journalists whispering. Activists sat in the gallery, waiting. The entire city was watching. Malcolm walked to the stand with measured steps, his face unreadable. He had faced men with guns, men with bombs, men who had the power to take his life in an instant. This was different. This was a war of words, of facts, of exposing the truth in the one place where it could not be ignored. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, sat down. "Mr. Hayes," the prosecutor began, "can you walk us through the events of the night in question?" Malcolm's voice was steady, every word measured, every detail sharpened by rage and grief. "I was walking my dog, Rex, in my own neighborhood," he began. He made sure to say Rex's name. "That's when Officers Coleman and Mitchell stopped me." The jury listened, unmoving, as Malcolm recounted every moment how he complied, how they escalated, how Rex was shot for no reason. "How did you feel at that moment?" the prosecutor asked. Malcolm let the silence stretch before he answered. "I felt powerless," he admitted, "and I've never felt that way before." The jury felt it too. This wasn't just a trial, this was a reckoning. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. Every breath, every shift in a seat, every scratch of a pen against paper felt louder than it should have. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, especially on Garrett Coleman and Andrew Mitchell, who sat at the defense table, their once unshakable arrogance reduced to hollow stares and clenched jaws. The trial had dragged on for weeks. Testimonies, evidence, video footage, each piece of truth, stacking against them like bricks in a wall they could no longer climb. The prosecution had been ruthless, dismantling every lie, every justification they tried to spin. And now, it was over. Malcolm sat rigid in his chair as the jury filed back in. His pulse remained steady, his face unreadable. He had been in war zones. He had faced men with bombs strapped to their chests. But this was different. The judge turned to the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" The man stood, cleared his throat, and spoke the words the world had been waiting to hear. "We find the defendants guilty on all charges." The room exploded, gasps, murmurs, the clicking of cameras as journalists rushed to capture the moment. The city had been waiting for justice, and now they had it. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He simply breathed. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Order in the court." The murmurs died down, but the energy in the air remained electric. The judge turned his gaze to Coleman and Mitchell. "You abused your power. You violated the public trust. You brutalized the very people you swore to protect." His voice was sharp, unyielding. "And now you will face the consequences." The courtroom held its breath. For the crimes of excessive force, illegal search and seizure, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, I hereby sentence Garrett Coleman and Andrew Mitchell to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Coleman's face went pale. Mitchell clenched his fists, his breathing uneven, his world falling apart in real time. The gavel slammed down. It was done. As Malcolm stood to leave, a reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. "Mr. Hayes, do you feel justice has been served?" Malcolm met the journalist's gaze, his voice low, firm, and final. They got what they deserved. And then he walked away without looking back. The city had moved on. The headlines had changed. The crowds had dispersed. The justice system had done what it rarely did: hold men like Coleman and Mitchell accountable. But for Malcolm, the silence still felt loud. He stood in the cemetery, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the headstones. A cool breeze rustled the grass, but he barely felt it. Before him, carved in cold, unforgiving stone, was a name that should never have been there. Rex loyal to the end. Malcolm crouched, resting his fingers against the smooth surface, tracing the letters absently. His jaw clenched. He had won. He had done everything he set out to do. Coleman and Mitchell were gone, stripped of their badges, their power, their freedom. They would wake up every morning knowing who put them there. And yet, it didn't bring Rex back. It didn't erase the way his body had gone still in Malcolm's arms. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening into a fist against the gravestone. "You were right about them," he murmured, "right from the start." Rex had known. The dog had sensed the danger before Malcolm had stood his ground, had trusted Malcolm to protect him. And Malcolm had failed. His throat tightened, but he forced the emotion down. He had no regrets about what he had done. Every move had been calculated, every step had been deliberate. He had destroyed Coleman and Mitchell the way they had destroyed lives. And it had felt good. Malcolm let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You probably wouldn't want to hear that part, huh?" The wind shifted, rustling the grass again. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle, not fighting it. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulling out an old, worn photograph. It was him and Rex sitting in the backyard, the dog's ears perked up, tongue hanging out, eyes bright with life. He stared at it for a long moment before placing it gently against the stone. "I miss you, buddy." The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer, and for the first time, Malcolm turned and walked away. This time, he didn't look back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.